Part 1. The Forbidden Whisper. Hunger without footsteps.
What if death wasn't the end? What if beneath your quiet village, beyond the reach of prayers whispered in trembling voices, something stirred in the soil, not to rise, but to feed? Not with elegance, not with charm, but with rot, with gnawing, with a hunger so patient it never needed to leave its grave. Welcome to the forbidden myth of the Nachzehrer, a creature that doesn't walk the night, doesn't shimmer under moonlight, but instead devours in silence. It does not knock. It does not stalk. It chews. In the plague-ridden villages of Silesia, Saxony, and the shadowed borderlands of eastern Germany, whispers of something darker than death haunted the midnight hours. Not a vampire that hunted for beauty or lust, but a rotting thing that remained beneath the earth, tethered to the living by memory and name. Unlike the gothic predators later immortalized in novels, this creature bore no tragic past, no cursed love. It was neither seductive nor sentient. It was something worse, hunger given memory. The villagers never saw it, they never heard it walk, but they felt its presence. A child wasting away without a wound, a mother coughing blood into her pillow night after night, a father growing pale and cold even under the summer sun. The family faded, and the grave undisturbed. The earliest signs, they said, were sounds, soft, wet, rhythmic, chewing. Not imagined, not metaphorical, real, muffled, underground. The sound of linen being torn by rotted teeth, the sound of a corpse consuming its own funeral shroud. In medieval belief, this was no hallucination. It was the beginning of a feeding, a grotesque ritual of reverse decay. The Nachzehrer didn't need to walk, it was death turned inward. It began by gnawing through its burial garments, then fingers, then arms, then its own chest to reach the heart. Not to destroy it, but to make room for something else. A void, a hunger, a memory of life. And once it had consumed itself, it reached outward, not with claws, but with memory. It remembered the living, those it once loved, and began to feed, not on blood, but on their vitality, their warmth, their breath. And they withered, one by one. No wounds, no bites, just grief becoming hunger. In the archives of Breslau, one tale chills even the skeptical. A corpse unearthed during a bubonic outbreak was found bloated, its funeral linens torn from within, its lips bloodied, not by violence, but by self-devouring. No worms, no decay, just chewing. As if the creature beneath had refused to rest, had refused to be forgotten. This was the terror that gripped the old world, that some deaths were not final, that the grave could hold a hunger so powerful. It pulled the living down without ever moving. And the worst part, the Nachzehrer didn't kill indiscriminately. It killed with memory. If it remembered you, you began to wither. If it once loved you, you began to die. Because it did not walk, it unraveled. What if the first death is only the beginning? What if it still remembers your name? And what if tonight, beneath your feet, the chewing begins again?
Part 2. The Ritual Beneath the Soil, where hunger begins. The legends of the Nachzehrer don't begin in castles, nor in moonlit forests. They begin in famine, in plague, in silence too thick to be holy. And it begins not with blood, but with cloth. Ancient villagers believed the first sign of a restless corpse was not a scream in the night, but the sound of chewing, a soft, damp, rhythmic noise beneath the churchyard soil. They swore the creature began its unholy feast by devouring its own funeral shroud, as if eating the last veil that separated the dead from the living. This wasn't metaphor. They believed it utterly. Some even claimed they could hear it, the muffled kruk, kruk, echoing beneath the dirt, a chewing that wasn't of the body yet, but a warning. The hunger had awakened. Next came the body. Fingers chewed to bone, arms stripped to flesh, a chest caved inward, not by collapse, but by deliberate consumption, as though the corpse was making room inside itself for something darker to emerge. This wasn't escape. It wasn't resurrection. It was transformation. The Nachzehrer didn't rise from the grave. It anchored itself between worlds, half in death, half in life, bound to the living not by blood, but by memory, and it remembered those it left behind. The terrifying thing wasn't that it walked. It didn't. It stayed and fed from beneath. And those it once loved, they began to grow pale, lose appetite, speak of strange dreams, then collapse without a mark. Death by proximity, not by touch. No vampire's kiss, no sharpened teeth, just decay that started from the heart as if the soul itself was being chewed. Medieval death rituals changed because of this terror. People began to fight back with symbols, with soil, with desperation. Coins were placed in the mouth of the dead, not as payment to Sharon, but to block the jaw. Sometimes earth was packed beneath the tongue to silence the chewing before it began. Corpses were buried face down, so that if the soul tried to rise, it would instead burrow deeper into the earth. Heads were severed, mouths sewn shut with wire or bound with ash-soaked cloth. And in extreme cases, the heart was pierced with sharpened iron, not out of hate, but of fear. Fear that death might remember you. These were not superstitions, not to those who lived with the fear. These were weapons in a war against the unseen devouring. Because once the chewing began, there was no going back. No priest's blessing could reach that far. No candle burned deep enough. Once the Nachzehrer awoke, its hunger became memory, and memory became death. And the most chilling truth? It didn't spread through bites. It spread through loss. A father dying alone in the fields, a child succumbing first during a plague, a woman buried without witness or ritual. These were not just tragedies, they were ruptures, moments when the veil tore and hunger found a way back in. In these liminal deaths, the soul did not depart. It lingered, trapped, twisting into something darker, a void that remembered the love it once had and used that love to reach back into the world of the living. Have you ever felt your body weaken for no reason? Felt cold even in the sun? Heard a name whispered in the wind, your name, and turned finding no one there? Perhaps the dead haven't forgotten you, and perhaps beneath the soil, one is chewing your name even now.
Part 3. The corpse that chewed through memory.
The transformation of a Nachzehrer did not announce itself with screams or shattered windows. It came with stillness. A stillness so unnatural, even animals refused to cross the grave. Cows stopped grazing, dogs barked at empty earth, horses reared and sweated near untouched burial mounds. But to those who listened, truly listened, the warning was always the same. A faint, wet sound. Not thunder, not wind, but something like a jaw slowly grinding through linen and flesh. Chewing. The earliest records come from rural Saxony and Lower Silesia, where families began dying one by one. No blood, no wounds, just a child pale as snow, a mother coughing without illness, a father growing skeletal in weeks, and beneath them all, a relative, freshly buried, whose grave remained sealed, but not silent. Gravediggers, those weary custodians of the dead, began to report a terrible pattern. When coffins were exhumed, the signs were always the same. Shrouds torn from the inside, lips ringed in dried blood, fingertips chewed to bone, and sometimes the heart half-eaten. The body didn't rot. It fed on itself first, and then, somehow, on those it had once loved. One 17th century account from the town of Breslau tells of a plague victim buried quickly. His family, once healthy, grew weak. The youngest child died in sleep. The wife collapsed while praying. When villagers opened the grave, they found the man's jaw unhinged, his mouth packed with blood and cloth, his shroud gnawed away. They burned him, and the deaths stopped. But this was not an isolated tale. Across Silesia and Pomerania, folk rituals arose to stop the devouring. Coins in the mouth, soil under the tongue, decapitation before decay, mouths bound shut with waxed cloth, heads turned to the west so the dead could not find their way home. Because the Nachzehrer didn't walk, it reached. Through memory, through name, through love. And the dead did not always stay dead. Some variants of the tale speak of a white boar or pale dog seen prowling near the homes of the sick. It never attacked. It simply watched. The villagers knew this was no animal. It was the borrowed shape of the devouring dead, a soul made hunger, wearing a mask. And when it appeared, a funeral always followed. Even priests grew afraid. Many refused to acknowledge the legends. They called them heresy, superstition. But the people knew better. When the chewing began, no sermon, no incense, no Latin prayer could stop it. Only fire, only soil, only silence. In the town of Chemnitz, a famine year was marked by the sound of bells ringing at midnight. No priest had pulled the rope, no wind had stirred. Terrified villagers dug up the grave of Friedrich Melcher, the first to die that season. His corpse was bloated, his lips split and red, his shroud torn inside the coffin. They burned him, and the deaths stopped. There is a kind of grief that hollows, and a kind of memory that binds. The Nachzehrer was both. It was never about blood. It was never about lust. It was about hunger. The kind that doesn't fade. The kind that remembers you because it once loved you. And what it loved, it now feeds upon.
Part 4. The Rituals of Resistance When Death Becomes Warfare. In the old villages of Eastern Germany, death was not the end. It was the beginning of a war waged not with swords, but with shovels, stones, and ancient rituals whispered in dirt. Because once the Nachzehrer stirred, it would not knock, it would not climb, it would pull, slowly, silently, until the living began to vanish like mist at dawn. The gravediggers became the front line. They carried not only tools for burial, but blades for decapitation. The first sign was always hunger, not the corpses, but the families. A child stopped eating, a mother grew weak, the old dog refused to enter the home. Then came the whisper of chewing, and when the shroud was found torn from within, they knew what must be done. Coins in the mouth, soil beneath the tongue,
mouths tied with wax cloth. These were not symbolic gestures. They were weapons. Weapons to silence the chewing, to block the transformation, to halt a hunger that had memory. In some regions, sharp blades were placed atop the chest, so that if the body moved, it would sever itself. The goal was never peace, it was containment. When containment failed, violence followed. Exhumation became a sacred act. Clergy often refused to help, so the work fell to midwives, folk healers, and mothers of the village, those who had seen too much loss to still believe in silence. They opened the grave. They saw the signs. Then, the head was removed, the mouth filled with soil or ash, the eyes covered with stones, and in some cases, the head placed between the legs so the body could never rise whole again. These were not random acts. They were rituals, passed from whispered story to bloody reality. In one record from Thuringia, a healer severed a corpse's head, filled its throat with ash, and sang a lullaby, not to mourn, but to silence the soul. The deaths in the village stopped. It is said that for 9 nights after a burial, someone should stand watch, not to weep, not to pray, but to listen for the chewing. Because once the Nachzehrer began to feed, no priest's blessing, no candle's light could reach that depth of hunger. It did not need to rise. It only needed to remember. Some believe the Nachzehrer was born of improper death, the suicide victim, the plague victim, the one who died alone. Their deaths, untethered by ritual or witness, left the soul ruptured, the body incomplete, a perfect vessel for something else, a hunger, a memory, a name with no voice, but all the desire to be heard through chewing. The most terrifying truth? It does not walk. It does not seek. It waits, beneath consecrated ground, beneath a church you kneel in, beneath a home once filled with laughter. And even as you light your candles, say your prayers, sing your songs, it is feeding on what it remembers, on you.
Part 5. Hunger that remembers the curse of the first death. In Saxony and Pomerania, when famine struck, people feared not just hunger, but who would die first. Because in every village, the first to perish was watched long after they were buried, not out of mourning, but out of fear. For it was believed the first death did not end alone. It was the match, the ignition. The Nachzehrer did not spread like disease. It spread like grief that refused to fade. The villagers knew the signs: a pale child who refused to eat, a father whose strength withered with no wound, a mother whose lungs collapsed with no illness, and always, beneath them all, lay a relative, newly dead, undisturbed, yet still feeding. They believed the connection was not of flesh, but of memory. The Nachzehrer did not rise to kill. It remembered you, your face, your voice, your name. And through that memory, it pulled not your body, but your vital essence, your will to live, your breath in winter. As long as the memory lived, the Nachzehrer fed. The plague came in silence, but before the first funeral bell tolled, there were always omens. A dog howling, staring at nothing, a cow refusing to graze near a particular grave, a child crying in sleep, whispering a name they had never learned. These were not dismissed, they were warnings, warnings that the dead were hungry again. The most dreaded of all signs was not a ghost, not blood, not rot, but a white pig. A pale boar, seen roaming the village lanes at night, unhunted, untouchable. It did not bite, it only watched. And when it watched a home, someone inside always died. This was the Nachzehrer in another form, a borrowed body, a shadow of what once loved, now feeding from the edges of the world. The creature was not evil in desire. It was not vengeance, not cruelty. It was hunger with memory. grief with teeth, love inverted, a twisted echo of everything that once connected it to the living. Reports from Chemnitz tell of a famine year when church bells rang by themselves at night. No wind, no priest, just sound. The villagers knew. They dug up the first man who died that season, Friedrich Melcher. His body was ruddy, bloated, his shroud torn, his lips split from chewing. When they severed his head, the bells went silent. They say the Nachzehrer never leaves its grave. It needs no legs to reach you. It only needs to remember who you are. And that is why every death in those lands was not just a farewell. It was a possible beginning of a contagion of memory. The villagers did not bury the dead to honor them. They buried them to protect themselves from being remembered.
Part 6. The Rituals of Silence, Burying to Forget.
In the cold earth of medieval Saxony, death was not the end. It was a negotiation, not with heaven, not with the gods, but with hunger. And so the living became experts in the rituals of silence. They did not bury their dead with reverence, they buried them with precaution. A coin in the mouth, not to pay the ferryman, but to seal the jaw shut. A stone beneath the tongue to silence the first chew. Binding the mouth with waxed cloth, sewing it closed, turning the head to face the earth. Not one act was for peace. Every act was to restrain. Because the Nachzehrer was not stopped by crosses, nor garlic, nor holy chants. It was not a creature of sin. It was a creature of rupture. A death without closure, a soul without direction, a hunger that no priest could absolve. And when death arrived, without prayer, without witness, without peace, it left the door open for the creature beneath the dirt to feed. Some communities did more. Metal blades laid across the chest, severed heads placed between the knees, mouths stuffed with ash, salt, or earth, coffins nailed shut with iron stakes. In Pomerania, the first to die in plague years was buried under watch for 9 nights. 9 nights of villagers standing in shifts, ear to the soil, listening. Not for moaning, not for movement, but for chewing. When signs appeared, chewed shrouds, bloated bodies, blood at the lips, the grave was opened. No delay, no mourning. And then came the counter-hunger. Shovels sharpened, stones ready, old women singing lullabies as they poured ash into the corpse's throat. Because it was believed the soul could be lulled back to stillness. If not, the head was severed, the heart pierced, and the mouth filled with earth until no sound could ever escape again. The church called these acts superstition. They refused to bless them, refused to recognize the creature beneath the ground. But the people, they could not afford to wait for dogma. They had seen families vanish, had heard the bells ring themselves, had watched livestock flee from empty plots of land. They knew what scholars denied. The Nachzehrer was not just possible, it was present. One healer from Thuringia, an old woman named Marta, wrote in her journal, "We do not bury to mourn, we bury to bind, to silence, to forget. If the dead remember us, we are lost." Her rites saved an entire village. After 3 deaths in a single family, she performed the rituals herself when no priest would come. Ash, decapitation, a lullaby sung in tears. No one else died. This was the wisdom of the earth. You cannot stop hunger, but you can seal its mouth. You can tie shut its memory with soil and steel. But only if you act before it remembers you back.
Part 7. When the Earth Refuses to Forget, the hunger that spreads. When the earth refuses to forget, the hunger that spreads. In the year of famine, in the village of Stern, the bells rang at midnight. No wind, no priest, no hand, only sound. The sound of warning. The villagers, pale and shaking, dug up the first man to die that season. Friedrich Melchior. His body was bloated, his lips torn, his burial shroud shredded from the inside. Blood at the mouth, fingers half gone, teeth clenched mid-chew. They cut off his head and placed it between his legs. His mouth was stuffed with soil. The bells never rang again. This was not legend. This was record. Found in the archives of Breslau, in the margins of a priest's funeral ledger, written not in poetry, but in terror. And it was not the only one. All across Silesia, from Pomerania to Thuringia, the pattern held. The first to die was rarely the last, because the Nachzehrer did not walk, it waited. It did not knock on your door, it reached from the grave. It did not bite, it remembered. And that memory became contagion. This was a curse not of blood, but of presence. The dead, left unresolved, became more than bones. They became gravity, a silent force pulling the living downward into their own unfinished endings. Michael Ramft, in Domestication Mortuorum 2015, attempted to explain it away. Gases, natural decay, delayed putrefaction. But even he could not dismiss the terror found in so many cases. He wrote, "The first corpse often brought 20 more. No injury, no infection, just decay that forgot where to stop." In Saxony, graves began to face west, away from the village, not for symbolism, but to turn the dead's gaze away. In some towns, sharpened spades were carried not for digging, but for defending. Metal blades were laid across the chest to deter movement. Others used consecrated chains, because when the Nachzehrer stirred, it did not rise, it pulled you down. Some claimed to see it not in human form, but as a pale pig or a white dog lingering near homes where death came quietly. Not beasts, but borrowed shapes, the vampire in disguise. It did not snarl, it did not chase, it simply watched. And then, someone died. The old believed in phases of feeding. First the soul, then the shadow, then the flesh. This too was written. In a chronicle from Chemnitz, an entire family fell ill after sightings of a white boar that could not be touched, could not be hunted. When the grave of a recently buried widow was opened, her ribs were cracked inward, her tongue gnawed, her jaw clenched, as if mid-feast. You do not see it, you do not hear it, but it remembers you. And the moment your name returns to its forgotten lips, you begin to fade. There is no escape from a hunger that once had your face, your voice, your mother's arms, your child's breath. There is no prayer that closes that wound. There is only silence or resistance.
Part 8. The memory that devours, echoes in the forgotten soil.
They say there is nothing to fear in the dark, only what we bring with us. But what if the dark remembers you first? What if the soil beneath your home knows your name better than your priest, better than your children? The Nachzehrer is not seduction, not sin, not the crimson elegance of Gothic halls. It is rot, it is silence, it is grief that refuses to loosen its grip. Long after the Black Death subsided, long after the wars had passed, long after churches were rebuilt and reason reigned, the people of rural Saxony still buried their dead with stones in their mouths, cloth binding their jaws, blades across their chests. Not for tradition, not for beauty, but because true hunger never dies. Even as scholars scoffed, even as theology advanced,
villagers still gathered in the chill of night, listening to the ground for muffled chewing, listening for the past, trying to finish what it started. There are still records, hidden in dusty churches, of exhumations deep into the 19th century, of miners buried in collapse, found fresh and bloodied months after death, of widows with their mouths split, ribs shattered inward, of bells tolling with no hand, of cows refusing to graze near old plots, a famine that began not in the stomach, but in memory. Because the Nachzehrer doesn't need to walk to reach you, it only needs to remember. It needs no fangs, it has your name. And so long as your family whispers it, even in prayer, even in mourning, the bond stays, the tether holds, and the hunger continues. It is not a creature you can burn, not a fiend you can seduce, not a legend you can romanticize. It is the refusal of death, the devouring of what should have been forgotten. So the villagers buried their dead with care, with restraint, with weapons. They mourned through ritual, through silence, through soil packed heavy on the chest, because mourning alone was not enough. They did not bury to honor, they buried to protect. And even now, in the black soil beneath forgotten cemeteries, there may be graves, still chewing, not to rise, not to walk, but to pull us back into the ache of unfinished endings, into the ache of being remembered by something that should not be. This is not just the story of the dead. It is a warning to the living. Beware the grave that cannot forget. Beware the hunger that does not sleep. Beware the silence that knows your name.